between 1979 and 1981, the city of Atlanta was gripped by a fear that struck at its most vulnerable. A series of murders claimed young lives, most of them children and young men from the city's black community. The pain and the pressure were immense, and for a long time, the investigation struggled for answers. The break, when it finally came from a science then in its infancy, the forensic analysis of fibres, and from a splash heard in the dark from a bridge. This is the story of a thread. The victims were overwhelmingly young, children and adolescents, and some young men, and the community they came from lived through a period of genuine terror. Parents kept children indoors. The city organized searches and curfews. There was also deep and justified anger about whether these crimes against poor black children were being taken as seriously as they should be. Any honest account of this case has to hold that pain and that anger at its center. The investigation unfolded under the weight of a grieving, frightened community. As the toll rose, investigators came to believe that many of the killings were connected, but connecting crimes is not the same as solving them. The victims were often last seen alone, in public places, with no witnesses to their abduction. There was little conventional evidence, no reliable eyewitness to a suspect, no confession, no obvious link between the scattered scenes. A large task force worked the cases under intense scrutiny, and for a long, agonizing stretch, it could not produce the one thing everyone needed: a name. The breakthrough began with something almost invisible on the bodies of a number of victims. Forensic examiners kept finding tiny textile fibers, threads that did not belong to the victim's own clothing. At first, this was just one more piece of trace evidence. But as the same unusual fibers turned up again and victims, analysts across TOST realized they might be looking at a signature. Fibers transferred from a single environment. The victims had all somehow passed through. The question became, where did these fibers come from? One fiber in particular stood out, a distinctive coarse yellow-green carpet fiber with an unusual cross-section. To the eye, it was nothing. Under a microscope, it was highly specific. Fibers can be characterized by their shape, their dye, their chemistry, the way they were manufactured. This one had a combination of features rare enough that if analysts could identify its source, it would point to a very particular place. The whole case would come to hinge on tracing one ordinary-looking strand of carpet back to where it was made. This is the detail the case rests on. Forensic scientists traced the fiber to a specific type of carpet, made by a particular manufacturer in a limited production run, and sold in a limited quantity in the Atlanta area. Statisticians estimated how few homes in the region could contain that exact carpet. The number was strikingly small. The fiber was no longer a vague clue. It was close to a fingerprint of a place. And when detectives eventually had a suspect, that suspect's home contained carpet consistent with the very fiber found on the victims. The power of the fiber came from its rarity. A common fiber proves little. Half the city might share it. But a fiber from a limited carpet line, sold in small quantities, is different. When examiners could estimate that only a handful of environments in the whole metropolitan area could have shed that exact thread, the evidence became genuinely discriminating. This was among the first times fiber analysis was used at such scales, and with such statistical rigor in a major American case. And it is why the case became a landmark in forensic history. Then the investigation made a decision that would, indirectly, catch the offender. As details emerged, including through the press, the fact that fiber evidence was central. The killer appears to have understood the danger. The pattern of the disposals changed. Where victims had been left where fibers could be recovered, Bodies now began to be placed in the rivers around Atlanta. Water strips away trace evidence. The offender was, in effect, trying to wash the fibers off. That very adaptation handed police their opportunity. Investigators reasoned it through. If the offender was now using the rivers to destroy fibered evidence, then he had to bring the victims to the water, to the bridges that crossed it. The rivers, meant to erase his trail, in fact concentrated his behavior onto a small number of predictable places. The vast city narrowed once again to a few specific points. Police decided to watch the bridges over the rivers at night, waiting for the moment the offender came to the water to do what the fiber evidence had driven him to. Teams of officers were posted at bridges over the Chattahoochee River and staked them out through the night. A patient, uncomfortable vigil, watching dark water and empty spans for hour after hour. It is the kind of unglamorous police work that rarely makes the story, and it is exactly what worked here. The offender's own attempt to defeat the forensic evidence had told the police precisely where to wait. All they had to do was be there quietly when he came. In the early hours of a night in May 1981, officers staking out one of the bridges heard a loud splash in the river below. Something heavy hitting the water. Moments later, a car was seen on the bridge. It was stopped and its driver checked. His name was Wayne Williams. There was, at that moment, no body and no proof of a crime. Just a splash, a car, and a man with an explanation. But the splash had put him on that bridge at that hour, and the investigation now had its first real suspect. The stop on the bridge did not, by itself, prove anything. A man driving across a bridge at night is not a crime, and he offered an innocent-sounding reason for being there. Had there been nothing else, it might have ended as a footnote, but the splash had given investigators a specific person to examine at the exact place, and by their reasoning had predicted the offender would appear. From a city of hundreds of thousands, the fiber logic and the stakeout had produced a single name to test against the evidence. Days after the stop on the bridge, the body of a young man was recovered from the river downstream, consistent with something heavy having entered the water that night. Now the pieces could be brought together. If fibers from this victim matched the environment associated with the man stopped on the bridge, the splash, the stop, and the science would converge into a case. Examiners turned to the victim's body and clothing, searching for the same kind of trace evidence that had defined the entire investigation. The fibers recovered from the victim were compared to fibers from the suspect's home and car. They matched the same distinctive carpet fiber, and other fibers besides, consistent with the environment the suspect lived and drove in. The thread that had appeared on victim after victim now tied directly to one man's house and vehicle. The abstract, statistical argument that only a handful of places could shed this fiber collapsed onto a single, concrete environment. The science had, at last, found its source. What made the forensic case powerful was that it was not a single fiber, but a web of them. Investigators identified numerous different fiber types, from carpet, from a bedspread, from the car, that could be associated with the suspect's environment, and that appeared, in various combinations, on multiple victims. Each fiber alone might be explained away. Together, the sheer number of independent matches formed a pattern that was, prosecutors argued, extraordinarily unlikely to arise by chance. It was forensic science woven into a net. The trace evidence went beyond textiles. Animal hairs consistent with the suspect's dog were also associated with the case, adding another independent strand to the web. This is the quiet power of trace evidence. A person carries their environment with them invisibly. The fibers of their carpet, the hairs of their pet, and leaves traces of it on everything and everyone they contact. The offender could change his disposal methods, but he could not stop shedding the microscopic signature of the world he lived in. Trial, the fibre evidence took center stage, and in a sense the science itself was on trial alongside the man. Prosecutors walked jurors through the rarity of the fibres, the statistics of the matches, and the improbability of coincidence. The defense challenged the methods and the certainty. It was one of the first times a major American jury was asked to convict so heavily on the strength of fibre analysis. The way the case was argued would influence how trace evidence was presented in courtrooms for years to come. Wayne Williams was convicted of the murders of 2 adult men and sentenced to life imprisonment. Although he was tried for only those 2 cases, the fibre evidence had been used to link him to a number of the other killings. And following his conviction, many of the cases were considered closed. The thread that had first appeared as an almost invisible clue on the bodies of victims had become the backbone of one of the most significant forensic prosecutions of its era. Honesty requires acknowledging that the case has never been free of controversy. Williams has always maintained his innocence, and some in Atlanta and beyond have questioned whether every case attributed to him was truly his, or whether the reliance on fibre statistics was as conclusive as it was presented. Reviews of the evidence have been sought over the years. This account does not pretend to settle those debates. It records what the investigation found and how it caught its suspect, while noting that the questions around it remain real. Whatever one concludes about the lingering questions, the forensic lesson of the case is clear and lasting. A person carries their environment on them, invisibly, and leaves it behind on everything they touch. The offender understood that fibres were the danger and tried to wash them away in the rivers. And that very attempt drove him onto the bridges where police were waiting. The evidence he tried hardest to destroy is the evidence that defined the case. You cannot outrun what you shed. If you want more case files like this one, the real investigations, and the single detail that finally cracked them, consider subscribing to the channel. Every episode looks calmly at how a crime was solved, without sensationalism, and without the gore, and without pretending the hard questions away. The Atlanta case is where fibre forensics came of age, and a reminder that the smallest thread can carry the heaviest weight. Thanks for watching.